as you look at this offseason and kind of the moves you make to remodel the roster, when you think about the trading, acquiring or sending away players in trade, how does your previous experience with acquiring players and kind of how you took advantage of that market a little bit help inform the decisions you're making on the other side?
I guess it's a equal and opposite type reaction, but very similar. The experience of acquiring players is very similar to the experience of discussing, let's call it moving on from players with other teams. So again, it's case by case, it's supply, demand, it's all of those things. It's all of those forces and variables that help you try to make a sound decision.
And then as you're making decisions based on when you move on from a player, basically post June 1st and pre-June 1st, how much do you take into account wanting to take a lot of maybe some of that dead money in this year and keep a cleaner 2024? Or do you like philosophically kind of prefer to spread it out among 2 years?
Really good question. A lot of variables involved there. What's interesting for us this year, step one is actually getting under the cap. Let's call it when the bell rings on Wednesday. And that sometimes will limit your ability to hold on to a player till June 1, even though you could release him Wednesday post, and designate him June 1. He is still counting right in the moment. So there's a lot of calculus that goes into that, especially with our roster. It's a very complicated, complex situation that we got to work through. And I think what big picture is this year different than probably the past 5 years for us. We definitely have to engineer a healthier cap situation, just because obviously we're not in a luxury tax situation. So we can't pay our dues annually. We can push them out. They can compound. So we have elected, right, based on the cap and based on what we've done, that all right, let's our DNA is to attack, hit the gas. We're going to have to hit the brakes a little bit. That does not change, right, how we're going to approach the season, how we're going to approach the day-to-day, but it might will definitely change how we approach constructing the roster.
Thank you.
Eric.
Hey, Les, thanks again for doing this. Wanted to get your assessment of this year's group of edge rushers coming up through the draft, and then how do you evaluate getting a guy that's going to need some development in the draft versus maybe exploring free agency and getting a guy that you already know can do that?
Well, usually I would answer that, Eric. Usually when you're someone that's probably can affect the passer, consistently week in and week out and still in your prime, those players aren't usually available in free agency. There are times, right, when you might have a player who's on their third, fourth, in the back nine of their career and can still disrupt the passer, but maybe lesser than he did in his prime. And then the rookies are almost the opposite, right? Because they may have all the traits to be able to affect the passer. The college game is different than the pro game. So at that point, right, you have to assess who's available, right? Do they have the traits to consistently disrupt the passer? Okay, that's one thing. Do they have the intangibles to work at reaching their potential? And at the end of the day, how long will it take us to develop them, help them evolve into what you call an effective pass rusher? And then I do think the other part, Eric, is if as an example, you don't think there's one person who can do that, is there an element of let's call it constructing a collective, and that usually is some version of a 4 to 5 man rush. And let's just try to keep it simple. Maybe all of the players, of course, Aaron Donald's an A player, but let's just say we can't get another A player. Can we find some, let's call it 3 to 4 other B players that can partner with Aaron? And then as a collective, they may be an A bunch, an A- bunch. If you see where I'm going with that analogy, metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Do you like this year's group better than last year's group? There's a lot of guys that were were taken in the first 3 rounds last year.
Wow, I've been so focused on the present, I forget last year. Who's last year's alumni? But here's what I will before we get into that, because I've been focused on the present. I can tell you that it's been a fun bunch to watch. Whether they're edge or interior defensive linemen, sometimes we nicknamed them elephants, and for no other rhyme or reason. That might be Joe Barry. But point being, there's a lot of tweeners. Yeah, I think if you watch the combine, Daniel Jeremiah will call it tweeners, where you're seeing that in college football, where a lot less 315 pounders, a lot more players that maybe 260 to 280, but can play both inside and out. So not necessarily traditional Von Miller-esque outside linebacker, but we've seen, a little bit what Baltimore does a lot with some bigger edge players. That the interesting thing is these young men, I do think it's how they train for the combine. The sports science element has gotten a lot more specific, effective. A lot of times you'll see these players go to the combine, they will train for the more straight line events. That's the vertical and broad and the 40. And then we'll come back and then train for the east-west, sideways, agility drills, the short shuttle and 3 cones at their pro days, just because the training's so different. So they definitely maximize, right, their explosiveness and the ability to run fast in the 40. So that's where you got to work in how fast are they actually playing football versus a different part of the central nervous system, a little more complex, a little more taxing on your central nervous, right, to figure out, hey, run, pass, blocking scheme, play the run, go rush the passer, than just, hey, let me run a 40-yard dash or 10-yard dash.
Cool. Thanks, Les. Appreciate it.
Greg.
Hey, Les.
Who is this?
Greg Beecham from the AP. Hey, man.
How's it going, Greg?
Good. Can you tell us as much as you can about the way you're thinking about your quarterback situation right now? Is Matthew Stafford carved in stone as your QB1 for this season? And if so, then what do you want to try to do behind him in this offseason?
I think we're going to definitely rely on Matthew. He's definitely one of our pillars. So with that being said, I think as I said, step one of this thing is getting under the cap. Unfortunately, to get under the cap, that usually means, trying to figure out, it usually means deletion, right, with some of your better veteran players who are making higher salaries. And it can also mean maybe there's an unrestricted free agent or 2 or 3 or 4 that you can't necessarily re-sign to get under the cap. But there are some players that have been here, that have done that have shown they can change the math in a football game. Matthew Stafford being one of them. Unfortunately, last year, right, he went through a tough time with the injury. So, the recency bias of last year's inconsistent for him, other than the fact that there was injuries and there was a lot of injuries around him. But he's definitely someone we're going to rely on, and we're going to have to rely on as we do remodel this. And we can figure out what we want to call this, whether it's I think we'll take a poll at the end how we want to do this. I'll let y'all get involved. Is it a remodel? The reason I said remodel, not rebuild, is a player like Matthew Stafford is, to me, in a rebuild, you would just bulldoze the house down and begin rebuilding from the ground up. But when you have someone like Matthew Stafford, players like Cooper Kupp, Aaron Donald, Sean coming, there's some weight-bearing walls there that we still have, and we're going to rely on those. Don't want to put pressure on them, and at that point remodel around them with maybe different teammates, different partners, and then even ask some of the players who've been here, still here, right, to keep evolving and going in that direction. But it'll be interesting what the best way to term that. But I did want to articulate, that's why I termed it a remodel. Not sure if that's the best word other than a rebuild, because I look at a rebuild as you bulldoze a thing down and start over.
I've been watching a lot of home renovation shows too, so I get where you're coming from here. Yeah. What can you say about Baker Mayfield and where he's at? What did he do for himself? I don't know how much you can say about guys specifically like that, but what do you think he did, and what did he do for you? Well, I meant to ask you this last time and I forgot to ask you. So just sum up of Baker Mayfield.
Well, I'll sum it up by being, I think I mentioned it when it occurred. However long probably however long y'all cover this game, some of us work in it, we're probably going to always tell the story of, wow, in the tail end of a not so good season for the Rams, a guy like Baker Mayfield gets cut. We claiming he shows up sometime in the middle of the week or probably the day before a Thursday night game and wins that game. Now, the reason I bring that story up, that you've written about it, you can't really write too much more about it, but I think that probably articulates who he is more than anything. There's an element that a QB has this, we always call it the it. There's it, and that's part of his it, right? That he's a competitor. He's going to look at it as, hey, this is a game. Let's kick off and start the game, and we're going to have a chance, and let's go do it now. And I think that what happens is when somebody truly lives that's how they live. That kind of oozes into the locker room. People believe it, say, let's follow this guy. So I think that's a neat thing about getting to know Baker in that short period of time, because he was put in a tough situation in having to come in and learn an entire new offense and actually get in rhythm with players he'd never worked with before. Pretty cool.
Thank you.
Jordan.
Hey, Les, how's it going?
I'm good. How about you?
Good. Thanks for doing this today. As it pertains to, I know you can't get into specifics ahead of next Wednesday at, I think, 1 p.m. But as it pertains to some of the departures you guys are preparing for, and also some of the negotiations you're having right now, how much of what could be coming for your defense is a function of who your head coach is and his particular skill set on the offensive side of the ball? And then also how much of that maybe shift in overhauling that side a function of the direction that the league is going right now?
All good. All of those variables are definitely a part of it, right? If we do, and we're heading in that direction, right, to be able to, as we call it, engineer a healthier cap, even get under the cap, start with some of our defenders. So yes, you're right. We have a head coach who's offensive coordinator. He's shown that, right, he can definitely let's call it give us an edge on that side of the ball. We do have some veteran players. We mentioned Matthew. You have Cooper, Rob Havenstein, Tyler Higbee, some of those players on the offensive side of the ball. So you have to somewhat pick one side or the other, or spread it out. And we've walked through many scenarios on how to do that. And doing it being, yes, in an ideal world, in a utopian world, probably in a world where there's more luxury tax, you'd probably try to bring back everyone, or if not everyone, add others, people like that. But unfortunately, in our situation now, we're going to have to move on from some veteran players. And that being said, going back to the weight-bearing walls, we're definitely going to rely on Sean, his coaching staff, even Raheem and his coaching staff. Right, if we do make it harder on them, and in terms of maybe having to play with new partners, younger, less experienced players. So we got to continue relying on our scouts, coaching staff, even front office, to listen to them, make the sound decisions, maximize the draft, coaching staff, athletic performance to help develop these players. Obviously, our coach staff has shown they can definitely, let's call it engineer, let's call it designs that give us an edge, and we'll continue doing that and relying on our veteran players and make the most of it.
And then in terms of your offensive line, a lot of your depth guys also got hurt last year. I know, understanding some of them probably have to hit some rehab milestones before you have an official clarity on where they're at and where the state of your line is. But how do you decide what to add or maybe subtract to that position group, understanding the severity of the maybe circumstantial factors that hit them last year?
I think initially we'll take it to the draft. And again, it's going to be subjective. We always try to take best available player at certain positions. Again, that's all subjective, but we'll have a board and I think we'll get through the draft. And at that point, hey, did we draft any offensive linemen? Did we not? At which positions? Let's just say we drafted a tackle. We're going to move that player to guard initially, things like that. And then you put the lineup on paper and you get to OTAs and, like you said, continue rehab and get to training camp and let everyone gel. And the negative of last year is oftentimes, right, if you get a lot of starters decimated, maybe we would have learned a little more about Alaric Jackson, but he got injured as well. So what you have to do in this case is really take the body of work of like someone like Alaric or Tremaine Ankrum, even the small body of work of Logan Bruss and the body of work he did at Wisconsin and go, okay, that's why we brought these players here. That's why we kept Tremaine over the years and Alaric over the years. That's why they started in some cases over the years and really bet on those players continuing to evolve in jail. And that will be determined really post-draft into OTAs, into training camp of who those best five are.
And then last quick one for me, if possible. This coaching staff has gone through substantial turnover every single year. At what point are coaches included in the draft evaluation and decision-making process? What point in the calendar? And then also, has your process in that regard changed over the years based on the amount of attrition that group has?
We definitely onboard them quickly into the process, depending on how far you play. This year different than the year before, based on how long the season lasted. But this one similar in that Sean was still hiring coaches into last week. But we've tweaked a little bit of our, when we drip the college players to them, but we drip them pretty early this year. We do that in phases and stages to keep it simple. Hey, here's some players that we may or may not be looking at 36, and let's kind of focus on those players, evaluate them, discuss them, have a base rate with those players, drip some other players who do any of those players belong at 36? What if we trade back? Things like that. And then you just begin dripping these players in phases. So these coaches have been, let's call it engineering what's going to be our, let's call it RAM schemes for 2023, and also prepping for the draft.
Thanks, Les.
Gary? I can't hear you, Gary.
Gary's on mute.
Yeah, we still can't hear you, man.
That's more than a mute problem there.
Yeah. All right, Gary, we'll come back to you. Yeah, we'll come back to you, man.
Dylan's laughing at Gary.
Well,
That's a foul.
better.
That's
Same
a foul.
company, same garbage computer. So does that sound okay?
We got you, man.
Okay. Yeah. No, our company's broke, man. So, Les, I was wondering, just kind of based on your conversations with McVay, if you kind of get a sense of where he is, kind of in terms of, maybe has he made peace with some of these things he was dealing with to where you're comfortable, fairly confident that he'll finish out his contract? Or do you kind of think that it'll be kind of this thing will be like an annual thing where every year he's reevaluating things? And if it's the latter, how does that maybe affect how you go about, charting the path forward for this organization? And like, say, do you have any kind of contingencies if he were to say, leave at some point?
No, I definitely think Sean's taking the right steps, took a step back and definitely has an action plan. I think when he sat down to determine whether, he wanted to coach or not in 2023, it was more than just 2023. It was for, let's call it a longer term range. So I don't think you're going to see Sean each year determine whether he wants to coach or not. I do think there's a possibility where every year you might hear his name in television based on if there's a job opening there. But I don't think that's going to be Sean ignited. I think that's just where he is in his stage of the career, how much, those networks appreciate Sean and maybe what they think he can do for them in a color role. So we might see that every year, but I don't think you're going to see Sean trying to determine whether he really wants to coach or not. I think he spent some time this year and figured that out.
So, and I think Jordan touched on this a little bit earlier, but again, as you're kind of plotting, I think she was kind of more talking about this year, but even kind of as you start projecting ahead of that, right? I know you don't just look at like 1 year at a time. You sometimes have to look a couple of years down. I take it to mean that then the McVay remains as much as integral a part of that as you kind of plan for the future.
Oh, definitely. And again, coaches, I would say coaches usually are definitely more microscopic than telescopic. But Sean, as the head coach, has to be, a little more telescopic than even his coordinators and assistants are. So we're definitely always talking and trying to discuss, that 23 and 24, you can get into 25 a little bit. Sometimes that's that could not be an efficient use of time because 3 years is a long, long time in the NFL. But we definitely talk about, if we, how do we maximize 23 and even 24 and try to determine what we do in 23 and how does it affect 24. So, so very, let's call it nuance would be, yes, we do got to get under the cap this year. So that's going to cause us to put the brakes on in terms of spending. But that if we do it like we've done in the past, and in the past, it's been a little more, hey, we may have a UFA or two that we want to resign. So we're not going to go out in the UFA market and add players. Sometimes it's via trade. But the point being, what I'm trying to say is, even when you focus on the 23 offseason, you're going to definitely discuss if we do it this way, there's definitely a good chance that we end up with 4 more compensatory picks in 24. So instead of maybe having 17 draft picks, it could be 20 to 22 over the next 2 years. So you're always talking about, when you do tee off in 2024, more than likely all 22 of those players wouldn't make the team. There's a good chance that you got, 15 to plus, players in their first and second years that are going to, definitely not add experience, but maybe add youthful urgency and physical qualities.
Thank you, Les.
All right, let's see if we go back to you, Gary. Got you? Yeah, we still can't hear you, man.
Gary, it's not the LA Times fault.
Yeah, it's not. We don't have you muted here.
Wi-Fi.
I'm not sure. All right, we'll try again. We'll come back to you, Gary.
You got to type it in the comments, Gary.
Yeah.
Let's go. Adapt and evolve.
Modesty, it feels like 2021, man. We got Kevin Modesty back.
Kevin, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Good to see you all. I wonder if you could clarify for those of us who might be a little slow catching up again. You talk about stepping on the brake, getting under the cap. How is that priority any different than it's been in our experience many recent years?
Maybe in the past we've used draft capital to maybe go get a veteran player, knowing that veteran player is going to cost a certain amount. We could actually fit him under our cap situation. So with that being said, in this situation, maybe you don't use draft capital to get a veteran player, but instead you use the capital to draft, let's call it normal rookies. With that being said, again, rookies helping cap situation based on the salary structures, and also in an intentionality of when you do have a core, let's call it a core layer of veterans who are getting into their prime, and on the other side of the prime, you definitely want to be ready to replenish it. So that would be a good example of that, and we've seen it. And hey, stepping on the gas or pressing the gas or using the brakes a little bit more doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying one or the other is better. We've seen teams, let's call it engineer their rosters in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. And then thinking about the many high profile injuries you had, I don't know if you can give us any update on any of those guys, or tell us, does any of their recovery timetable or anything force you to make any moves to replace them, temporarily, or see what I mean?
They do not. So it may force you to adjust when they get on the practice field, and things like that. But it's at this point in time, it's not adjusting. Okay, wait a minute. We have an issue, going into the season. I know there's a few teams out there with players where you read about them, and one of their key players may not be healthy until 6 to 8 weeks into the season. So we don't have any of those at this point in time.
Okay, so everybody will be projected to be ready for the season.
Yes.
For camp, for training camp itself.
I would say, don't you might fact check me on that, eat my words, but the answer is yes for camp. But I can say that we haven't really sat down in the meeting and said, okay, this player might need to ease into camp. A lot of times that's still to be determined based on how between now and then goes.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, Gary, let's try you one more time. Oh,
I can hear you.
oh, we got you. We got you now, Gary.
Okay, fantastic. Les, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your patience.
Thanks for finally showing up, Gary.
Hey, in mentioning your cornerstones and weight-bearing walls, you did not mention Jalen Ramsey, Leonard Floyd, or Allen Robinson. Are you actively seeking to trade them? And do you anticipate they will be on the roster late next week?
I'm going to keep the specific of those in-house because time will tell. I know we've communicated with a lot of our players, those included. So we're trying to assess situations, figure out how to get under the cap, what's the best way to do that. And in this year, it's been interesting with those players. It's based on probably the dynamics of the league. We've had calls on a lot of our players, teams, probably other places trying to figure out what are we doing big picture and things like that. And it's been a busy offseason discussing players, and other nice thing is other teams would like to have a lot of our players. But you don't want to, at this point, we don't want to give away all of our good players.
Were you calling or taking calls at all on Matthew Stafford?
Again, I'm not going to get into who we've actually taken calls, but I can say this, that probably taking calls on 9 players. I think I counted before this press conference. Definitely discussed. Y'all can figure out the rumors of them. Usually it's the best, is some of your better players. I can't say every now and then you get a surprise and someone might be interested in one of your younger players based on I always give the example. In the past, Joe Noteboom was always one. We got calls on him every year based on him being our third tackle, and other teams thought he could be their starting tackle. So I give that example in the past, but I'll keep the sensitivity of the specifics in-house until we get to next week and see how all this plays out.
Thank you. And thanks for your patience, everyone, actually.
Yeah. Stu.
I'm not sure Dylan is on the same page.
Stu.
Hey, Les, as you guys are going through this remodel, has it made you rethink, if at all, just the guys you try to target on day 2 and 3? Historically, it's been guys who have maybe, let's call it, I guess, redshirted, that first year and then developed into contributors, or are you guys maybe trying to look for guys who could potentially make a more immediate impact if they're called upon from those depth roles?
I think we'll keep the philosophically probably be very similar, but that's a good question. There could be an adjustment of because each time you go to pick a player, you really try to bet on when that player will be ready. So could that change? Let's call it in a case-by-case situation. Okay, wait a minute, this player could be a little bit, we usually say, hey, higher ceiling, but lower floor. And you'd rather have someone who might be better right now. But oftentimes we like to, I think we often say in the draft, if you pick right who you really think fits, it usually works out, no matter how long it takes them to get on the field. And sometimes the situation is you're just, maybe you have less veterans. So when you do have less veterans, it somewhat forces you to put the younger players on the field earlier, and maybe you find out earlier that, wow, we were fortunate we were able to do that. So every now and then a thorn has a rose.
Thank
you. And we still at the end, artists, we got to figure out, we want to take the poll of what we should call this.
Rebuild, remodel, restructure, all that type of stuff. We'll ask Dylan, man. Dylan always has some nice words.
Restructure sounds really like severe, actually. To me, that sounds worse than rebuild. Corporate restructuring is not good, man.
We got a really good branding. This is our opta.
Yeah, restructuring means you and I are swapping jobs, artists.
Hey, we'll wrap up with you, Eric. Last one.
Hey, Les, you didn't go to the combine. Sean didn't either. Are we getting to the point where the combine has kind of ran its course in terms of how it helps you evaluate these guys, or are there still elements that you're able to get out of it?
I think there's definitely still elements where it's very effective. As an example, even though I wasn't at the combine, but there was a subset of, I would call it, skill players. Let's take wide receivers as an example. Maybe in college football, they run certain routes. Maybe they're more vertical players, but you can basically the next day after the workout, you can watch them somewhat run the route tree and figure out, okay, how far they are from being comfortable running. Let's call it a more sophisticated route tree versus a simpler one, or hey, is anatomically, their body's better suited for certain things. So I do think that the combine is very useful. And what you've seen with us and maybe some other teams is really who goes and why, and the efficiency of it, of time spent, time traveling, maybe some dead time at the combine, and what can you do in the office. So combine's very important. We still use it. Again, it's case by case and it's very intentional. So, but you can also see where, like I said, these players are training for the combine and they're probably setting records every year in some of the drills that are measured. So again, that can complicate things because maybe you're comparing this player to a player 4 years ago, and doesn't mean it translates on the football field. But wow, in Indy on that day, he ran fast or did some drill very, very fast or jumped really, really high.